Welcome to Isabella True Crime Meaning Stories channel. We hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. My name is Isabella and I have always considered myself a devoted wife and mother. I have always been there for those I hold dear, giving all my strength and care to my family. In my view, my role was clear and irreplaceable. Joshua is my husband and together we built a home filled with the sounds of children's laughter and warmth. However, lately I began to feel something strange. There was something unclear in the air, as though the life that had once seemed so clear to me had suddenly lost its meaning. "Hi, Isabella." His voice was warm and calm. "Would you mind if I helped you with the flowers?" "Hi, Arthur." I smiled, trying to hide my emotions. "Of course, if you're not busy, I'd appreciate the help." We started working together in his hands. The flowers looked as though they were part of something greater, and his movements were confident and precise. We were silent, but I couldn't help noticing how easily he seemed to connect with them. Every gesture, every glance made my heart race, even though I was trying not to acknowledge it. When he handed me the vase, our hands accidentally brushed. I felt something stir quietly inside me. I couldn't understand what it was. Just an accident or something more. I pulled away, but the tension didn't fade. It hung in the air between us and I couldn't grasp where it had come from. "You know, your garden really is beautiful," Arthur said, his voice soft and penetrating. I continued working, but the inner feeling only grew stronger. I realized my thoughts had gone too far. Everything I had once considered unchanging now seemed on the verge of transformation. After that morning incident with the flowers, I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was happening. Between Arthur and me it had been such a minor touch, but it left a mark as if a stone had been thrown into a lake, leaving ripples on the surface. On the outside, everything continued as usual. I was preparing for the party, Robert was at work and the kids were doing their own things. But inside me something important was taking place. The next morning I was in the garden again, this time decorating for the party. My husband Joshua was always absorbed in his work and I didn't mind. I was used to being alone with myself. I didn't need anyone to make everything perfect, but this time I noticed how strange it felt to be alone without Joshua by my side. Thoughts about something having changed kept flickering through my mind, but I couldn't understand exactly what. Then I heard a voice. It was Arthur and his tone sounded deeper than I remembered. He was standing on the steps where I was preparing to hang the garlands and his eyes met mine. I felt my heart skip a beat and it was uncomfortable because I had never thought of him like that before. "Isabella, do you need help?" His voice was soft, almost quiet, as if he could sense my state of mind. "Oh, hi. Arthur, I think I'll manage, but if it's not too much trouble, could you help me with the ladder?" He stepped closer and immediately offered to hold the ladder I was standing on. In that moment our hands met. I felt a rush of warmth shoot through my fingers, just a casual touch. But it awakened so many emotions inside me that I barely stopped myself from pulling my hand away. He didn't notice, but I felt the tension thickening in my body. I tried to focus on the task at hand, on the garlands, but his presence became something more tangible for me than just a neighborly gesture of help. "How's everything?" he asked as we worked. "How's the family?" "Everything's fine," I replied once again, sensing that strange shift in the conversation, as if my words couldn't hide what was happening inside me. We finished the work, but I continued to feel his presence near me. When he left, I stood still and watched him walk away, not understanding why it wouldn't let me go. I could feel emotions stirring within me, emotions I hadn't experienced in a long time. That day I couldn't concentrate on anything else. His words and touch wouldn't leave my mind. It felt as though he had become something important to me, something I couldn't simply ignore. I didn't know how to explain to myself what was happening in my mind. I tried to return to my usual state. I am a wife, a mother, a housewife, and everything around me should be under control. But thoughts of Arthur wouldn't go away. They kept coming back like intrusive images, distracting me from my usual tasks. It was strange. I couldn't understand what exactly had changed within me. Several days passed and I found myself alone in the house again. Joshua had gone to work and the kids were busy. Everything seemed the same as always, but as soon as I decided to go out into the garden to distract myself for a bit, the thought of him appeared again. I tried to focus on the upcoming party, but he stood in my mind like something inevitable, something I couldn't shake off. 1.0s. When I heard someone calling me, I instantly recognized that voice. It was Arthur. This time he simply came to me without any particular reason, other than the fact that I was once again alone with myself. He offered to help once more, but I couldn't respond with certainty with every one of his appearances. I felt how something indescribable had gathered between us. "Isabella, aren't you lonely by yourself?" he asked, smiling slightly as he appeared at the gate. I felt everything in my body freeze. There was something in his voice that I couldn't ignore. He was looking at me, and in his gaze there was not only interest, but something deeper, something that didn't just feel like friendly care, but something personal, even intimate. I tried to hide it smiling, but my heart was uneasy. "Hi, Arthur," I replied, my voice a little shaky, though I hoped he wouldn't notice. "I'll manage, really. But if you're not busy, maybe we could work together for a bit." "Seriously. It wouldn't even bother me." We began working. We talked about everything and nothing at once. His gaze never left me, and with each passing moment I felt how difficult it had become to remain on the level I had always been. Everything around me seemed blurred, and he was like a strange magnet, pulling me closer and closer. Suddenly I realized that this was more than just an ordinary encounter. It was something else. I felt it not only physically but mentally as well, as if a part of me was drawn to where his presence was most strongly felt. After that day I was on the edge. I could no longer imagine my life without these meetings. These brief conversations, these moments when our gazes would meet and the world around us would disappear. I felt that something was changing, but I couldn't find the strength within me to stop it. The evening was filled with guests, lively conversations and laughter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Arthur was somewhere nearby. It was a strange sensation, as if his presence existed in the air, barely noticeable but unmistakably real. Joshua and I spent time with friends talking and laughing, but I couldn't focus. My eyes involuntarily searched for him in the crowd. Arthur was the center of attention, telling some story that made everyone laugh. He was as bright and cheerful as ever, but for me he was something entirely different. When our eyes met amidst the sea of faces, I felt a flutter in my C*******T. Everything I had once considered familiar and safe suddenly felt unstable. At some point I found myself at the drinks table trying to hide my nervousness. There were many people around, but in that moment it felt as if everything had disappeared. He came over to me, his gaze intense yet gentle, and I didn't need words to understand that there was something more between us. We exchanged a few words, probably meaningless, but each one felt like part of something important. And then it happened. His hand accidentally brushed against mine. It was so subtle, so barely perceptible, that I could have convinced myself it hadn't happened at all. But in that moment I felt something stir inside me. I froze as if time had stopped. My heart began to race, and I realized that I couldn't just ignore this strange magnetism between us anymore. "Sorry," he said, almost apologizing for the accidental touch. "I didn't mean to embarrass you," I nodded, but there was something in his eyes that made me fall silent. I couldn't find the words to express what I was feeling. Everything I felt was now tied to him. He wasn't just present in the room. He was in my mind, in every movement, in every glance. The shadows of attraction continued to grow. I could no longer find a point of support to return to my body. My feelings, my thoughts. Everything now belonged to this moment, to this interaction with him, and though there were people around, it felt as though we were the only ones there. I tried to return to reality, but each moment with him pulled me further away from it. A few days later, when I decided to take a break from the hustle and family worries, I went into a cafe. It was a small, cozy place with soft lighting and the smell of freshly brewed coffee, perfect for some time alone. I hoped I could clear my head and calm down, but as it often happens, fate had already prepared its surprises. As soon as I walked into the cafe, my gaze immediately landed on Arthur. He was sitting at a table by the window, absorbed in his laptop screen, but as soon as I entered he looked up and met my eyes. A smile spread across his face and I felt something tighten sharply inside me. He stood up and invited me to sit, and although I felt I should refuse and go home, I still walked over to his table. All it took was his kind, warm gaze for me to give in to my inner desire to stay. "Isabella, do you mind if I invite you to sit down?" His voice was calm, but there was something in it that made it especially enticing, as if he knew I needed to be near him. I sat down, unsure of what to expect, but knowing for certain that this would be more than just a brief conversation, we began talking about trivial things, books, what had been bothering me lately, and his studies at university. But gradually the conversation turned more personal. With every sentence, I felt more and more how his attention soothed me, how his words comforted me. Inside, a strange feeling of comfort began to grow, a comfort I hadn't found at home. Joshua was physically nearby, but his attention wasn't as genuine. You know, sometimes I feel like something important is missing, I said unexpectedly, not realizing how sincere the openness in my voice sounded. He didn't rush to answer, but his gaze became more intense, as if he were really listening to me. I felt that I could be open, that he would understand. "You're not alone," Isabella Arthur said, looking me straight in the eye. "I get it. I think we all feel a little lost in all this hustle. Sometimes you just have to stop and admit that it's important to be understood." His words sounded so sincere, so personal that I couldn't help but feel his closeness. It wasn't just consolation. It was real attention. And at some point I realized that his words weren't just words. He really saw me for who I was, without masks, without excuses. He understood me in a way no one else did. At one point, our gazes locked and I felt the silence fall between us. It was thick, almost tangible, and I felt like the world around us had disappeared. We both knew that this moment wasn't just a coincidence. We both knew that it was something more than just a conversation about books or morning routines. "Do you come here often?" I tried to break the tension, but I felt my words becoming insignificant. I waited for his response, hoping this moment would last longer. "Often when I need to be alone with myself," he replied, and in his voice there was a slight shadow of deep understanding. I could no longer deny what was happening between us. What I was feeling wasn't just a random coincidence. He was becoming a part of me, a part of my thoughts, and I felt that I couldn't walk away from it. When I stood up to leave, I met his gaze once more. It was so confident, yet so attentive. I knew that our meeting was just the beginning of something I couldn't predict. I left the cafe, but his words, his gaze, they stayed with me. I returned home late in the evening, but thoughts of Arthur wouldn't leave me. They haunted me like a shadow that wouldn't let me breathe easily. It felt as though I was beginning to lose control of myself. All I thought about was him, his words, his gaze, his presence, which I could feel so clearly as if he were somewhere nearby, even when I was alone. 1.1s. That evening Joshua came home late. He was tired from work and, as always, he immersed himself in his routine. We exchanged a few words, but I could barely focus on the conversation. We didn't talk about what was troubling me, about how I was feeling. In his eyes, I didn't see what had once been important to us. Joshua continued to live his life and I mine, desperately trying to hold back from drowning in these new feelings. But that night everything became clearer. I lay in bed, unable to sleep, and the same words, the same moments with Arthur, continued to echo in my mind. Somehow a few days later he found himself at my house again. He came to help with the computer as he had promised. I knew it was just help, but deep down I felt that this was much more than just another kind gesture. When he entered I felt that once again something in the air had shifted. We were alone in the house and I could feel his presence filling the room. We sat next to each other and I tried to focus on the screen, but I couldn't get rid of the thought of how close he was. I felt his warmth beside me, the scent of his skin, and it was becoming too intimate. At some point he leaned slightly toward me and I felt his breath brush against my cheek. It was so close that I could barely hold myself back. I looked at him and his eyes met mine, full of such tenderness and some strange intensity that I felt everything inside me tighten. He was so close that it seemed there was only one step left before we would not just look at each other but touch Isabella. His voice was soft yet tense. At the same time, "Two can't keep this inside anymore." With each day that I spent away from Arthur, it became harder and harder to return to my usual life. Everything inside me was boiling, like a storm that couldn't be stopped. I tried to return to the world where I was a wife and mother, but the inner conflict wouldn't let me rest. I couldn't forget him. His gaze, his touch. They wouldn't let me go. No meeting could be simple. We met secretly in those rare moments when we could be alone, and each time everything became more intense, more desperate. I knew it was wrong, that I was crossing boundaries that had once seemed untouchable. But I couldn't stop. Everything I felt when he was near was passion, a passion I couldn't hide anymore. We met on the secluded terrace of a cafe on the same day, when I could no longer sit at home and pretend everything was fine. I was searching for answers and he, as always, was there to give them to me. We talked about what troubled us, about what remained hidden inside, but words lost their meaning. They couldn't express what was happening between us. He looked at me in a way no one else ever had. It wasn't a playful glance. It was a gaze that penetrated to the very core, and I knew that we both felt what couldn't be hidden. Isabella, his voice was soft, but there was determination in it. You know, I can't ignore this anymore. I think about you all the time. It's not just attraction. It's something stronger, something I don't understand. But I can't hide it anymore. I couldn't answer right away. His words stirred a storm in my C*******T, and I felt a hot wave wash over me. My mind tried to resist, but my heart, which was telling me I couldn't stop, led me forward. I looked at him and suddenly everything around us disappeared. He was so close and I couldn't resist the pull. My hands trembled as I placed them on his C*******T. In that moment, everything I had ever considered right disappeared. We kissed, and it wasn't just a kiss. It was the collision of three worlds where there was no room for doubt or regret. Everything inside me froze and I realized that nothing would ever be the same. I could no longer be the person I was before with every touch of his. I felt my doubts dissolve, making way for feelings that could no longer stay hidden. Are you sure you want this? His voice was trembling, full of anxiety, but I could see how he was holding himself back, not knowing what would happen next. He couldn't demand anything from me, but his eyes said it all. We both knew this was something more than just physical attraction. It was a secret passion and it was only ours. But in our hearts we both knew that after this moment nothing would ever be the same. The secret meetings continued, each time we met in different places where no one could notice us, an old park, secluded corners of the city, empty streets after sunset. I knew we were taking risks. I knew our actions could destroy everything, my family, my life, our friendship with Arthur, but I couldn't stop. Everything between us was so real, so intense that I couldn't walk away from it. Every moment spent with him was filled with passion, as if we were trying to make up for lost time, trying to connect with each other not only physically, but soulful. We talked about what troubled us about, things we could never tell anyone else, but there was always a shadow between us, something we couldn't openly name, a sense of guilt, the feeling that we were breaking every possible rule. And yet the more I tried to understand what was happening, the stronger the feeling that all of this was inevitable became. But one day I couldn't hide it anymore. I couldn't keep living in this dual world, my family and my love for Arthur, which I couldn't ignore. I realized that I needed to do something to make a decision. I could no longer hide. I knew there had to be a moment when I would tell Joshua the truth, and that moment came when I confessed to him. I saw how his face changed, shock, pain, disappointment. That was all I saw in his eyes. Joshua couldn't believe it. He couldn't understand how it had happened, how I could betray him, our family. In his eyes, there was not only anger, but confusion. Everything I had once built shattered in an instant. But I knew I had to take this step. I couldn't continue living a lie. Are you out of your mind? His words were full of bitterness. How could you? We've always been a team. We can try. He finally said, his voice much quieter than before. We can try to work through this. If you're ready. But that night as I stood next to Joshua, I realized that perhaps we both had begun something new. We had both decided to fight for our family, and that was all I could offer at that moment. But the thoughts of Arthur, despite everything that had happened, continued to torment me. And although I had made the decision to stay with Joshua, I couldn't forget what had been between me and Arthur. It hadn't disappeared, and I knew that something in my life had changed forever. If you enjoyed this suspenseful story and want to hear more, please make sure to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more thrilling content. Your